So President Biden is actually headed to Israel, to the West Bank, in the days ahead, and we're still sort of trying to understand what happened in the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh. And you know what, Tom Rogan, he's a foreign policy writer at the Washington Examiner. He joins us now to talk about this. Tom, first of all, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
And secondly, Tom and I actually were talking about this, we were at a party actually earlier this week celebrating the 4th of July, and I was talking about the difficulty of having this conversation and sort of understanding it from the perspective of somebody on the right, from the perspective of somebody who's generally pro-Israel, and Tom, your views are always really nuanced. You took a dive into understanding, as you know, we have analyses from the Associated Press, from CNN, from Bellingcat, that all seem to approach the same conclusion, that this came from the IDF. And you know, there's been controversy over the bullet itself. We've covered it on this show. I tend to agree with what we've seen come out of the CNN and AP analyses. When you dug into it, what conclusion did you come to as you wrote this piece?
Well, I think the first thing is that, you know, the evidence does tend to suggest, and pretty strongly, that the bullet was fired by an Israeli soldier. And because of the grouping of the journalists who all at least in the area where Abu Akleh was standing, were all wearing blue media jackets. You know, there's a sort of basic, you know, prima facie concern that, you know, okay, at a minimum, we should want to know how this happened. And so, you know, that it was worthy of further investigation. I suppose that's my primary point. You know, that there is also the fact that the bullet did enter Abu Akleh's head, just behind the ear. And, you know, the question then, was that deliberate? You know, I suspect it probably was not, in terms of that they were specifically, whoever fired the shot was targeting her. But at a minimum, it seems to be a breach of Israeli rules of engagement, which tend to be pretty strict, partly to avoid situations expressly like this one, where a media individual is killed and the negative ramifications of that reverberate in terms of Israel's position on the international stage.
And what do you make of the willingness of the American media across the board? And not just the willingness, but the kind of aggressive resources that were deployed into, you know, exploring how she was killed. Particularly at CNN, you know, if you recall, there were a lot of concerns raised when Tom Nides was named ambassador to Israel, because he's married to the head of CNN's news gathering operation, and so to have CNN, you know, come out with this exhaustive and authoritative report, you know, pointing the finger at the IDF in this shooting, seemed rather extraordinary. What did that say about how the politics of this are unfolding in the face of all of these early Israeli denials about what had happened?
Yeah, I think there was you know, frankly, it's been really good journalism. The New York Times as well, the Washington Post. You know, I think my piece was probably one of the more basic ones, but one of the fewer ones perhaps in conservative media. And you know, I think it does reflect that as you say, Ryan, in the early days, the Israeli government was you know, vague, distant about what had happened. In fact, Naftali Bennett, the now former Israeli prime minister, suggested that it was a Palestinian weapon that fired the lethal shot. And so, you know, I think, again, there was a skepticism on the part of media, but also, you know, a desire with an American journalist, right, obviously a dual Palestinian-American citizen being killed, to try and find out what happened in a way that you know, if any of us, you know, were in the West Bank and shot in similar circumstances, I would imagine we would want media colleagues to look into it. So I think it's a good thing.
Well, and that's an important element of this because they were clearly identified as press. It's another very difficult thing to get around, that we're to believe that the Israeli forces who fired the shot, or seem to have fired the shot pretty clearly, couldn't see that there were press jackets, press helmets, which seems hard to believe, but it gets into this question of motive, which you explored in your piece, which, again, from the perspective of somebody who's generally pro-Israel, is really hard for me to piece together. What is the motivation in this case? Why do something that would cause this level of outrage? A very beloved Palestinian-American Christian journalist, especially in Palestine. So, Tom, this gets to how President Biden will talk about this, if he talks about it, if he addresses it, which I assume he will have to answer questions from the press when he's in Israel in the days ahead. What is your take on the motive, and what do you think that means for how American lawmakers should approach these questions?
Well, we do know that an Israeli commando unit had come under fire during a raid earlier that morning, and it seems to be that the shots were fired from an Israeli cordon position, which is to say, blocking, egress, movement by potential terrorists out of the area. The one thing that I think would give the Israelis, a sense of justification, at least on the part of the ground unit that fired the shots, was that you can see in some of the video fighting-age men not in press gear around the journalists. The challenge, I think, is, and now, so if there had been spotters to say, okay, there are fighting-age men here, now they're approaching your position, that's one thing. The challenge is that the specific group that Abu Akleh was in did tend to be, at least from the imagery I saw, coalesced around all in blue media persons, going down a quite sort of tightly a defined corridor, as it would, so that the Israeli soldiers from the firing point would see that group. So there are questions to be asked. I mean, it is hard to see at a minimum how this didn't breach the rules of engagement, but potentially, why were those shots fired?
Mm-hmm.
And Tom, did you get any reaction from the Israeli government, and also on the shots themselves? We're talking about 200 meters? Do we know whether or not there was a scope used or not? If there's a scope, you very clearly could see. Press was very large font, but you can probably see it without a scope. But with a scope, you certainly can. And then I've also seen it reported that several of the bullets also hit the tree right nearby, mm-hmm. which suggests very concentrated, targeted fire rather than just a random spraying of bullets that accidentally, wound up hitting Shireen in the face, because she was wearing a helmet and she was wearing, armor. So there was really only, it took a very precise shot to kill her.
Yeah, you can see that in the photos and videos. There's a tight shot pattern. Yeah.
Right. The limited number of shots that you think about it is indicative that it wasn't a heavy light machine gun, etc., just pumping rounds down the alleyway. That point to the scope is critical. I think that has been raised. I've seen that. We don't know, I think, for sure. But again, we should want to know, right? That is something we frankly need to know, because it does give a lot more indication as to motive and culpability. I did not have any reaction that I saw from the Israeli government, but I do think it is interesting that perhaps we haven't seen as much coverage of this on the right, which I think is something that frankly is a little concerning to me, because again, this is an American journalist who was killed. Being pro-Israeli does not mean that you just don't cover a story that might be negative for Israel, and I that isn't, to me, that's not right. If it was a British soldier who'd done this, I would have said, let's figure out what that British soldier was doing. And I'm a dual American as well. So anyway, all right.
Yes, I was going to say, you're a little both. Well, Tom Rogan, foreign policy writer at the Washington Examiner. I know you were up late last night covering all the breaking international news. We appreciate your time this morning.
No problem. Thank you.
We'll be back with more Rising after this.